We are officially at a new low for the Golden State Warriors, a team that largely has defined the last decade of NBA basketball. One of the most transformative teams that we've seen in the league in years, a team that changed the league in more ways than maybe almost any team ever has, is now reaching a point where they might just be completely forgotten. And this whole era, including Steph Curry and Golden State, might just be completely over. Now, I talked about this not too long ago, but the context is completely different now, because at the time, I was more so discussing the fact that Golden State hadn't built a good roster around Steph going into this season. They, obviously missed on James Wiseman, Kuminga, Moody. These guys are, high first-round draft picks that are still kind of TBD in terms of how they're going to positively impact the team. We talked about the Jordan Poole situation in terms of dumping his contract, what he would possibly look like on this roster. We talked about all that, but this now is getting to a completely different point for Golden State. Obviously, we have the Draymond stuff to talk about, and then we have to talk about kind of how Steph's legacy or his impact on this team long-term could be affected by how this season and this upcoming offseason goes. First and foremost, you can't really talk for too long about Golden State without mentioning the Draymond Green stuff. He is indefinitely suspended at the moment as the recording of this video, and it seems like it's going to be at least a couple of weeks before he returns to the team, which makes total sense. I mean, you go through all the different, incidents and issues that he's had, whether it be Jordan Poole, whether it be Rudy Gobert, whether it be any of the stuff that's happened, Nurkic, it's something that needs to be addressed, and that's always going to be a negative for this team because Draymond, despite the issues that he causes, is still a really good defensive player and someone that's been critical for them over the years. And that just kind of adds another, element of uneasiness and not really knowing what the future and the direction of your team is during the season if one of your best players is just going to miss a couple of weeks with an indefinite suspension. That has to be mentioned. The other part of this, though, is one of the things I would argue maybe one of the things that people love most about Steph is the kind of teammate that he is and has been throughout his time in Golden State. You never really hear him complain about anything publicly. He never really has an issue with any of his teammates. There's never really any rumors about him being unhappy or wanting a trade or wanting the team to improve or upgrade the roster. And really, when you go around the league and you think about it, he's kind of the only guy that does that. At least that has really had the opportunity to. Like, Jokic hasn't really had the opportunity to because they were kind of an up-and-coming team, and now they're really good. There's no reason for him to push for them to do anything, and they've built the roster well. Giannis was one of those guys for a while, but then he kind of forced them to make the Drew Holiday trade the first time and the Dame trade the second time, and that's kind of one of the two categories that you fall into. You fall into, kind of the Giannis category, where you're going to use your leverage as an impending free agent to force the team to upgrade the team, or you're going to be, one of these Bradley Beal, Kevin Durant guys where you're going to request a trade and force the team to move you. And really, when you look around the league, Steph is kind of the only guy that if he shows up, you're probably going to win between 45 and 50 games, and he's not really going to complain about anything. Even someone like Joel Embiid that has had a disaster team building situation around him for years, this past offseason started to float the idea of maybe not being in Philadelphia long term. We've never gotten that indication from Steph. In an era in which every other star in the league at one point or another moves teams, whether it be free agency or trade request, or forces the team to upgrade the roster by threatening to leave. In an era in which everybody does that, Steph doesn't do that. And that's the thing that I think separates him, differentiates him historically within this era, and it's something that so many people love about him. However, even though that has served him well, multiple championships, they bring in Kevin Durant, all this stuff, even though that has served him well, we're officially at the point now where it might have benefited Golden State if Steph was a little bit more like some of these guys, like Giannis, a couple of other guys that have kind of forced the hand of their front office. And if he doesn't do that, or if Golden State doesn't make significant changes, this could be it. This actually could be it for the Steph Curry era in Golden State. I don't necessarily mean that they're going to trade him or that he's going to look to leave or anything like that, but the idea of Golden State always being involved in the conversation as possible contenders could basically be over. And a large part of this, to me, circles back to a couple of basically impossible questions for Golden State. And it's, it goes back to what if the Draymond punch had never happened, right? And what if Jordan Poole was still on the team? And what would that look like for them? Even though obviously he's looked terrible in Washington, he was good for them, and he provided a scoring punch that this team, scoring punch, I can't believe I just used that phrasing, a scoring punch that this team desperately needs. And that's not there anymore. You also have to think about, what would it look like if they were to try and change the roster, because in that conversation, Klay Thompson has to be involved. And the, kind of the impossible question that goes along with that is like, would they ever do it? And what would it mean if they did trade him? Who would it be for? Could they trade for Donovan Mitchell? Could they trade for a variety of different guys to try and extend this era? Because no matter which way you look at it with Golden State right now, whether, you can have a ton of different reasons for why this is the case. But right now, if they continue with this team moving forward, there is no championship championship upside. There's no upside to making the finals. It does not exist. And I know that they won the title a couple of years ago, but this is a different team. Wiggins isn't as good. Draymond isn't as good. A lot of the pieces are different. It's just a different team. And Steph can still be incredible, but it's really difficult to come to the realization that it's just not going to happen ever again for a team that you're used to being so successful and is led by a guy in Steph who is still incredible, still an unbelievable player. And if they don't make changes, this is it. This is the end of, you can call it a dynasty or not. You can call it whatever you want. I've chosen to call it the Steph Curry era. It's over. That's it. And it's interesting to think about where they would be if potentially he was a little bit more like some of these other guys around the league that have pushed for the front office to make changes. Maybe you could argue they wouldn't have won the title a few years ago against Boston. Maybe you could argue they would have that, and they would have some more potentially and be better contenders now had they made those moves. And what it really comes down to for me at this point is Steph's not going to be that guy. He's just not. He can be maybe a little bit more unhappy than you would expect him to be, but he's not going to go to the team and say, hey, you got to trade Clay, because that's what it comes down to, really. They have to trade one of their bigger salaries, and most likely it would be Clay. He's just not going to do that. But I wonder if the front office at some point gets to a point of no return on this, where they're like, you know what? These are tough, difficult decisions to trade Klay Thompson, to trade a couple other guys, to try and, consolidate some assets. But we don't have a choice. I think that's a real scenario that they could get to, where they just feel like they have to make the move. It's not that they want to trade Clay. It's not that they want to let him walk in free agency to create some space to do some other stuff. It's not that they want to do any of those things, but it becomes a necessity because of the reality here that this era of Warriors basketball is going to be over without some absolutely massive, massive changes. If they don't do like a Clay contract plus some young guys plus some picks deal to try and put someone else alongside Steph that really works, try and add some size in the front court, a variety of things that this roster needs, then they're just accepting that they're going to be a 45-win team that isn't really going to matter when it comes time to actually contend for the title. And in most other situations, that wouldn't really matter that much because teams would just rebuild. They'd be like, hey, we've had an awesome run ever since 2014-15. We've had a really good team, and a decade is longer than most teams are able to stay relevant within the championship conversation. We've done it with multiple different versions of the roster. It's time to move on. It's time to go and do something else. Let's move some pieces. Let's do a rebuild and let's figure it out. The problem for Golden State is Steph is still really, really good. Like this isn't like, oh man, Steph's starting to decline. I don't know if he looks as good. He's not making as many shots. Steph is still awesome. So they can't really look at their situation and say, you know what, it is time to rebuild, because at that point you'd have to trade Steph, and they can do whatever they want to in terms of trying to move Clay, trying to change around the roster, trade some of the young guys. They are not trading Steph Curry. They are not going to be the team that traded the guy that has been as loyal as anybody has ever been in this era in which almost nobody ever is loyal. It's not on the same level as like Damian Lillard in Portland. Steph is on a higher level than that in terms of what he means to the franchise and what it would mean for the front office to make the decision to trade him. And we know he is not going to go to them and say, hey, you have to trade me. So it's just a difficult thing. With it feels like they have to try and restructure the roster with the point of trying to contend, but it feels like the smart thing to do would be to structure the roster and rebuild in a way that allows them to maybe be good again in a couple of years. And the Steph piece of all of this and his unwillingness to either push his way out or push the team to make a move actually makes this much more complicated, because you have to deal with the sentimentality of having guys like Clay on the roster you might have to potentially trade. And it just creates an unbelievably interesting situation, not only looking back on the decisions that the front office has or hasn't made because Steph has or hasn't told them to, but also because of what it could look like moving forward in the future for Golden State as it relates to their ability to contend for titles. And it breaks my brain just trying to think about what those options could be for them potentially.